Perfect. Great. Okay, so thanks very much again for the invitation to present. This could be pretty informal. If people have questions, please feel free to interrupt, or as Michael suggested, maybe put your questions in the chat and we can discuss as we get along. This is, I would say, maybe a bit of a platform adjacent topic. So we'll see how it weaves into the idea of practical and platform trials. And we'll speak maybe a bit about non-randomized uses of registries, which is some of the complementary nature of this sort of thing. So speaking about registry-embedded trials, here are my disclosures. I won't be speaking about any specific devices. So just to begin, so we have a common understanding. So, AHRQ, which unfortunately at the current moment, low in the United States sort of situation is maybe a bit on the outs at the moment. But AHRQ, which is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, has actually issued a lot of very important guidance on registries, in particular because many quality improvement infrastructure across the United States and the world is based in registries. So they have this manual called Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes, and they define a registry as an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data. These are very important things, clinical and other, to evaluate specified outcomes for a population that's typically grouped around some theme. So it could be a particular disease, a condition, an exposure. So today I'm going to be using the example of a device registry that serves a predetermined scientific, clinical, or policy purpose. And registries are important because, again, they could be the source of very robust evidence and maybe increasingly robust evidence in the era of big data. We'll talk a bit about that at the end of the presentation. But again, I think we're all agreed and we're all here because we're linked by practical and our belief, as well as in the medical community, about the hegemony of randomized control trials at the very top, or the gold standard of our ability to generate evidence around efficacy of interventions and looking at exposure outcome relationships. But as you know, they can't address all our needs. And sometimes we need, registries for things like timely determination of safety and real-world effectiveness of different interventions. This can be particularly useful in post-marketing surveillance studies as new devices, in particular, new interventions come to market. And again, you get typically some kind of indication creep. That's the one thing. And of course, it's the issue of generalizability or external validity, because often what happens is that clinical trials enroll very specialized populations, and now you're using your drug, your intervention, your device in a much larger target population, and the real world effectiveness and real world safety could be a very important thing that's monitored in registries. I would say both in critical care and in many other settings, there's been an increasing interest in the role of observational studies. And again, as you might know, we have observational studies running on the practical platform that use registries and other electronic data sets as infrastructure. And of course, we use registries, as I mentioned, as AHRQ is champion for things like continuous quality improvement. You can use it for benchmarking, large-scale epidemiology, and all these sorts of things. And again, as an example, during the pandemic, existing registries were a major source of robust data, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic when we didn't know a whole lot about anything. This is a great initiative called Logic that's launched by some of our colleagues in Europe that really wanted to understand what existing registries were around the world, particularly, again, in the response to COVID-19, because they wanted to leverage existing data sources and infrastructure across the world to help us better mobilize forces to generate knowledge, to understand, again, large-scale epidemiology, and hopefully eventually embed some of that infrastructure into future clinical trials around COVID-19. So here on the left, you could see across the world, and these are critical care registries. So really an abundance, I would say, of critical care registries. And interestingly, also spread across both high-income countries and low-income countries, which is very important. And here on the right, you could see, sort of looking at a survey of these global registries for critical care, you could see that many of them have no specific funding. I think this is still a problem, much like our platform trial, no specific funding for the infrastructure of the registry or the platform, but it's being done and cobbled together through various sources. Interestingly, at the time of the pandemic, not many of these were used for clinical trials. Again, that's something that we're trying to change, and data sharing being another thing that we're going to talk about, and many of them challenged by the ability to data share, maybe not within individual ICUs or cross ICUs, but across different agencies and external partners. Again, I'm going to use as a motivating example something that's near and dear to my heart, which is ECMO. And in ECMO, we have a number of device-specific registries around the world. Probably the best well-known registry is the ELSO registry. So this is a registry of the Extracorporeal Life Support Organization. It's pretty much been in existence since about the 1980s, started by Bob Bartlett, this cardiothoracic surgeon in Michigan, has now over 120,000 runs. It's a voluntary registry where ECMO centers around the world contribute data, and really started not as a research focus. Bob would have been the first to say that it was really to understand who was getting onto ECMO, why were they getting onto ECMO, and what happened to them after they got onto ECMO. So some very simple ideas around their outcomes like mortality, what complications occurred, and not a lot of granular data. But again, because the idea was to understand the large scale utilization, the idea for this registry was rather than going, deep and granular, was to be, relatively pragmatic. So limited data collection to get as many centers and broad representation as possible. Oops, let's see. Okay, and the reason that I think ECMO makes for a good example is because, again, in the randomized controlled trial space, performing randomized controlled trials in ECMO is challenging. So this is a nice editorial from Luciano Gannoni a number of years ago, who sort of described how feasibility is the major challenge of conducting randomized trials in extracorporeal support. We have two modern RCTs, as many on the call are aware. One is the CSER trial that was conducted in the UK. It took nearly a decade to complete, enrolling 90 patients. And the EOLIA trial, which was slightly better, took nearly 6 years to complete, enrolling 249 patients. And even though they are randomized trials, they're still subject, when you're conducting trials over such a long period of time, to secular trends. EOLIA is a good example. In EOLIA, in the middle of EOLIA, ProSiva was published, showing the efficacy of prone positioning and really putting prone positioning as a standard of care in moderate to severe ARDS patients. So in the middle of EOLIA, we had to change the trial protocol to include proning as a part of the standard of care in both arms. In EOLIA, we saw a non-significant 11% absolute risk difference in favor of ECMO. And if we wanted to confirm that risk difference in a new randomized controlled trial, enrolling at these sort of traditional rates, it would take over 600 patients. And even with 100 units, it would take nearly a decade to complete. So you can see here that the feasibility of trials like this, especially in the device space, is going to be challenging. The other major challenge is that the costs of trials are rising. Okay, so here's an example again of pivotal trials of therapeutic agents, but just to give an example, and I think device trials may even be more inflated than this, given the costs of the devices, the training that's required, and these sorts of things. But the cost for even industry to bring trials to market now in a pivotal trial, some are approaching $100 million. So how can we conduct feasibly in a resource-constrained setting and in a timely fashion, randomized trials for all the questions that we have around some of these very expensive devices, interventions, therapeutics, drugs? This is going to be a challenge. So we need to leverage efficiencies where we can find them. Okay, and it's not just costs. This is a great article from Michael Lauer, who is a cardiologist, who sort of describing costs, as you can see at the top left, as being a very important one. But again, timelines are becoming lengthier, and I gave the example there of ECMO, where both trials took 6 to 10 years to complete. Recruitment is becoming more difficult. There's regulatory barriers, sponsor-related barriers. There's a disconnection, and maybe, again, this idea, we'll talk at the end about the dream scenario of better implementation of research into routine care, academic barriers, and of course, with increasing globalization, which is a big hallmark of what we're trying to do with practical, and the collaborative around practical is trying to really enhance the ability for regional, national, and international collaboration to help facilitate trials, both in their conduct and, of course, to facilitate their generalizability ultimately when the trials are finished. And the key thing, I think, here of all the things is the money. So here's a picture of Ronaldo Bellomo, who's unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but really is one of the most cited critical care trialists in our field, working out of Australia and leading at the time the ANZIC's clinical trials group. But at DASMAC, which used to be sort of an open sort of TED Talk kind of forum around clinical research and critical care issues, he mentioned in Berlin that there are only two questions that you need to ask yourself when you're planning a trial. Do I have the money, and do I have the patients? And he sort of said that money, of the two, money was the most important, because if you have the money, people will get you the patients. So money is definitely a barrier. So again, finding ways to leverage efficiencies, especially around the resources of conducting a trial, are going to be key. And so again, and the idea is that we need to make these investments because they're important. If you think research is expensive, try disease. This is a great quote from Mary Lasker, who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom and was really an important health activist and philanthropist in the United States in the last century. So the idea here then is to leverage existing infrastructures to make clinical trial conduct more efficient. And one of the ways to do this is the registry embedded study, or sometimes called the registry randomized controlled trial, or RRCT. And this is the idea that you use an existing registry for one or several major functions of trial conduct and outcomes reporting. So again, you could use it from all the things from identifying patients to randomizing the patients within the registry. You use the data that's existing in the registry as the data collection for all the important endpoints and outcomes that you might have. And that leads to a lot of efficiencies. This could lead to greater generalizability because typically, if you're using a real world registry, this might lead to populations that are less selective than those identified in the screening of clinical trials. Again, using extracorporeal support as an example, the recent REST trial in the UK, led by Danny McCauley and James McNamee, only 7% of screened patients made it into the trial of extracorporeal CO2 removal for AHRF. So, trials could have better generalizability and less selected populations. Of course, depending on the registry data quality, just like in a randomized trial, we're collecting the data primarily, data quality will be of major importance. And there's a few different registry randomized control designs that you could see here on the left. Of course, the one that we're mainly focused on today is the idea of using the registry to conduct a typical parallel arm individual patient randomized design. But at the bottom, you could see that there's also the ability to use the registry to perform cluster design, stepped wedge design. So really, again, the registry is not changing the nature of the randomized trial per se. The registry is providing data infrastructure to, again, perform various, if not all, sort of parts of facilitate all the parts of the conduct of a randomized trial, but the randomized trial could still take the form that they traditionally do, even outside of being registry embedded or registry enabled. And of course, there are many advantages to this. Again, you might reduce the time needed for data collection. You might reduce the costs, which again, we think is a very important barrier in these situations. Again, you might be more efficient at identifying and including many more patients than you would through screening procedures. Interventions and outcomes can be captured in the registry. And again, this idea that you might have a less selective population, a more generalizable real world type of population, something that where the study population better mirrors the ultimate target population that you hope your drug, intervention, or device will eventually reach if the trial shows efficacy of that intervention. Some disadvantages, again, if you're using the registry for data capture and outcomes, like there may not be any flexibility available to have outcomes or endpoints that are different than what's collected in the registry. They may not, again, depending on the nature of the registry, be well defined because, again, the purpose of the registry may not have been focused on those endpoints that you decide are important. Of course, many real world data registries, including our own here in Toronto, may have missing data because they're done through routine collected clinical information. There may be variable data quality, which may be important, and so forth. I would say at the bottom right here, the key pillars are really not very different when thinking about a registry embedded trial than, in many ways, a traditional randomized controlled trial. You need about quality data collection, QA processes. You still have all the issues around informed consent, data protections, and sharing. You want to communicate with stakeholders. And really, there's some extra steps here around registry governance, how the data will flow, how it'll be shared, how you'll validate the data, and these sorts of things. But again, many of the same important features or themes that are in a traditional randomized trial are still germane in a registry embedded trial. And you can have a few slightly different flavors other than thinking about, again, the nature of the randomization, if it's cluster, if it's individual, if it's a stepped wedge or that sort of thing. You can have something called a registry based trial, RBT, or again, this more that we're focused on today, registry randomized trial. And a registry-based trial sort of might be defined more as really using the registry to identify or enroll patients, but not necessarily using it to capture all the data or outcomes, which again, we might be a more fulsome use of the registry, which is in the registry randomized sort of situation. So these are subtle differences that might be available, but again, typically, and again, most people, when they think about registry embedded trials, are thinking about this example on the far right, and that's the focus mostly of what we're talking about today. There's a taxonomy related to this, and this I want to show just for awareness. I don't think we need to go through this. Like there's some groups that have really worked on the taxonomy depending on how the registry is being used, whether it's capturing outcomes, it's identifying enrolling patients, and what type of data linkage it is. This is a pretty complex sort of taxonomy. Again, at least in the critical care space, we don't have a plethora of examples of registry embedded or registry randomized trials yet. So employing this taxonomy specifically in the field of critical care is maybe a bit of a misnomer at the moment in the cardiology and cancer fields, where there are a bit more bit more examples of these having been completed or ongoing. Maybe perhaps this might be useful, but just to say, maybe the third line here is the most interesting one, again, sort of highlighting the differences by which the registry can be used to facilitate a trial, from being linked to being compared, from registries comparing trials, emulating, using registry data to emulate trials. And again, today the focus being on using the registry to enable one, if not all, the functions of a traditional randomized controlled trial. We have some great examples. And again, the cardiologists are far and away ahead of us in this game. And one of the more prominent examples was this one called the TASTE trial. And again, here's Michael Lauer, a cardiologist at the time, was a section editor at JAMA, who published this editorial on the TASTE trial. And the TASTE trial was a study of thrombus aspiration versus usual PCI for patients who had acute myocardial infarction. And this trial was embedded in the Sweetheart registry in Sweden. So they used the registry, the Sweetheart registry, for basically identifying patients, randomizing patients, and the data collection. And they linked the Sweetheart registry to the Swedish National Registry for things like death and other administrative outcomes. Basically, they could identify the vast majority of their eligible patients through the registry. And 61% of all patients were randomized directly through the registry. Some were randomized outside who met inclusion criteria. And the rate of enrollment far exceeded what they had expected for the trial. They had planned for the trial to maybe last about 5 years. You could see that enrollment took just about 2 years to complete. And probably the most amazing part is the cost savings, because the primary outcome was mortality, and that was linked to their existing national registry. There was no loss to follow-up. And for all of their secondary outcomes like heart failure, rehospitalization, angiography, re-angiography, these sorts of things that were available in the Sweetheart registry, linking it to the Sweetheart registry cost them about $400,000 to get all their secondary outcomes, where they estimated that a similar trial run in the United States at the same time would have cost over $10 million. So the incremental cost per patient randomized in this thrombus aspiration trial was about $50. So I think that's pretty amazing, given what we saw before, that some trials now are costing upwards of $100 million. But in this trial, linked to a number of registries, primarily the Sweetheart, which was a pre-existing heart failure registry, as well as a national registry for death and other hard outcomes, really led to a very both time-efficient and cost-efficient trial. This trial, called the ULTRAC trial, is another example, which is maybe using a little bit of a different strategy for the registry randomized trial. This is a trial that's actually comparing two different standards of care that are available at different intervals for the treatment of advanced colon cancer. So they're looking at oxaliplatin and irinotecan versus continuous chemotherapy in untreated metastatic colon cancer. And the interesting thing here is that they're, again, using both of these treatment modalities are available, but were never tested against the usual care at the time, but never tested in a head-to-head comparison against each other. So they're both available therapies. So now they're testing them against each other, and they're using a registry, the ULTRAC registry, to capture all study-related outcomes. So they're actually not using the registry to identify recruit patients. Basically, patients that show up who meet inclusion criteria with advanced colon cancer get enrolled into the registry, and if they meet inclusion criteria and they consent, they also get enrolled in the trial. So the registry will capture their study-related outcomes, but it's a de novo entry into both the trial and the registry at the time that an eligible patient with colon cancer gets enrolled. So the interesting thing that's a contrast between this study, the ULTRAC study, and the TASTE study, is that this trial's been ongoing for the better part, I think, of about 10 years, because it's been very difficult to enroll patients in this study because, one, these patients actually are a bit few and far between, and second is that there's a lot of, interestingly, work that was done showing that there's a bit of skepticism or lack of awareness of what the registry randomized trial format really is. And so they've actually done some nice qualitative work where the idea is that there's nothing to lose and possibility of gaining and embedding this trial in a registry embedded fashion. But what they found out was that some of the limitations of using what they thought would facilitate things was that both on the clinician and the patient side, there was a limited understanding of how this was really going to work. And I guess part of that limited understanding contributed to the unease, if you will, about consenting to being in this particular study. So despite the fact that the experience of participating amongst those was that there was minimal impact on the patients, minimal impact on clinical processes for the clinicians working in the clinics, and minimal and less work for the study coordinators, what was key that came out of this is that probably we need more education and to increase awareness about this different format for conducting clinical trials that might help then to enhance or augment both patient and clinician awareness, and therefore maybe ability to get patients, both the patients into the trial and get clinicians to get their patients recruited into these trials. So very interesting qualitative work that taste where that sort of was off to the races and ran without much of a hitch. But in this particular cancer trial, there were some clear barriers where increasing in education and awareness could be very important. I mean, you could, on the alternative hand, like we used examples there of existing registries that were leveraged. And again, in the critical care space, we had quite a few that we identified through the Logic collaboration in the pandemic. You could actually create a de novo registry that might serve a number of purposes and be infrastructure for a new registry embedded or registry randomized trial. And again, there's some guidance from the United States, the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, or CTTI, that's sort of promulgated these sorts of guidelines around if you were going to create a de novo registry, one of whose main functions would be to enable or facilitate randomized or registry embedded trials. These are some of the things that you might want to think about, and sort of key because then again, some of the challenges we thought about registry embedded trials, like the data quality, the endpoints being collected, the data that would be available, how it would be shared, what the governance of the registry is. You could actually maybe those are less malleable in registries that are already existing in the world. Whereas if you're creating a de novo registry, one of whose main functions is to enable clinical trials, you could tackle some of these issues up front and maybe streamline those for the future conduct of trials. Again, extracorporeal space, so taking the learnings that we had from the ELSO registry, or the Extracorporeal Life Support Organization, which again, the idea was never research at its heart, although it's been utilized for research in many circumstances, was to create a complementary registry that was more granular, had longitudinal data. And again, the idea was not to go broad and shallow, but here to go deep and in more limited centers that had experience with clinical trials, and with the idea of creating a registry that could facilitate clinical trials in this space. So this is the Index registry, which is a global registry that is being led out of the International ECMO network. And we're using this actually as infrastructure for registry embedded trials. Kathleen Exconde is our manager. I think she's on the call. She's done an amazing job at getting centers all over the world to be included in this registry. This is done in conjunction with our colleagues in Australia and New Zealand who run the Excel registry. We have the same database, the same data elements, and the same CRF. The advantage in Australia and New Zealand is that their registry is embedded in their government-sponsored adult patient database that all ICUs have to report to. So ECMO centers around Australia and New Zealand are reporting data into the registry as a matter of mandate. And using this registry across a number of countries, we have an example of a registry embedded trial that we've recently completed. It's led by Lisa Higgins and Carol Hodgson in Monash in Melbourne, called the ECMO Rehab Trial. This was a phase 2 trial that enrolled 100 patients across the US, Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand. It was to looking at early rehabilitation of critically ill patients receiving ECMO to see if it would reduce disability when compared with standard of care. And again, here we use the Index and Excel registries for data collection, outcome ascertainment of the trial. Patients were screened traditionally by research coordinators at all sites, approached and enrolled by research coordinators after getting informed consent, but the data was all, and outcomes were all collected within the Excel and Index registries. Finally, maybe one of the other sort of important advantages of the registry-based randomized trial we sort of spoke about a little bit again is this idea of greater external validity or generalizability. And again, using a trial that's embedded in an existing registry allows us some degree of ability to assess trial representativeness. again, if you think about a registry that's based on a disease condition or state or device, you will get baseline data on all the individuals that are of the same ilk, including those that aren't eligible or aren't enrolled in your study, most importantly. And again, so this gives us the advantage of understanding what better the target population looks like. Again, the patients that we want to transport the results of our drug trial, intervention trial, device trial to eventually, and understand what the differences might be between those that are enrolled in the study and those that are out in the real world who were eligible but maybe not enrolled in the study, and why. But again, there might still be some complex issues with how we assess representativeness, even when we have these registry-embedded studies available. Again, often we find there may be differential missing data between enrolled and non-enrolled subjects. You might imagine a good example might be a non-enrolled patient is not enrolled because they're sicker, their SDMs are missing, they weren't capable of enrolling. So some of this data that's missing is not only missing, which is a problem, but the missingness could be informative or missing not at random, which is a real threat to validity. It can lead to bias. And also the idea that, again, at the end of the day, we want to consider the non-enrolled population who is eligible that are really a part of the target population. So we don't want to compare, we want to make an apples to apples comparison. So you really understand patients that could have been in the trial, i.e. they met the clinical eligibility, but for whatever reason, they're still part of the target population, i.e. we still want to include patients that didn't consent because they didn't want to do research, their SDMs weren't available, that sort of thing. There was some kind of logistical reason that they didn't enter the trial, but realistically, if the trial is efficacious, or the result is efficacious, those would still be the kinds of patients we would apply the intervention, the drug, or that sort of thing too. So these are the kinds of patients that would be included in the target population and the things that we want to assess representatives, the kinds of patients we want to assess representativeness in. Again, cardiology has some really good examples where we can draw some inferences from this. They have a number of examples in heart failure where they had both retrospective registries collected at sites that also functioned as trial enrollment sites in a randomized trial, and some that had simultaneous registries performed. So here's an example of the Victoria trial in the Victoria registry, which is a trial of a heart failure therapy. And the interesting thing here is that so the registry enrolled patients with heart failure at many more sites, about 50 sites in the United States and Canada, whereas the Victoria trial only enrolled patients in the randomized trial of the heart failure therapy in about 30 of those sites. So there's some overlap, but not completely. And what you could see here is that maybe if you just focus on the predicted mortality, again, sort of assessing representativeness, that the predicted mortality amongst registry patients, so that includes patients who are not eligible but not enrolled, and again, a very few patients who were eligible and enrolled because they were at sites that also participated in the randomized trial, that the predicted mortality was about 21%, but the actual mortality amongst patients randomized and included in the trial was much lower at about 12%. So again, there's a disconnect. And even if you just focus on the patients who were eligible, again, but not enrolled, so make up part of the target population that we hope to translate or export the result to if positive, again, the target, even the eligible and non-enrolled patients had a much higher mortality than those that were actually enrolled in the trial. So again, sort of suggesting there might be a very selected population of patients that were enrolled in the Victoria trial. And interestingly, they found that there's probably many reasons, both at the patient and site level, that led to non-participation, and about a quarter of eligible patients had no interest in trial participation. So again, sort of questioning some of the external validity or generalizability of our results. And again, when you do them actually simultaneously, so this is a conscious decision, and again, in a heart failure study, to look ASCEND heart failure, ASCEND HF, where they actually had a simultaneous registry and RCT at the same time. So in eligible patients with heart failure, they enrolled them both in the randomized trial and the registry at the same time. And so that included patients who were eligible and not enrolled in the trial, as well as non-eligible patients, but met the heart failure definition for the registry. They were enrolled in a registry at the same time. And again, maybe not surprisingly, patients in the registry, as compared to those that eventually got enrolled in the RCT, were older, less likely to be male, had some more comorbidities, more likely to have an ICD or pacemaker, and worse renal function. So again, showing there's actually important differences, right, in the populations that actually get enrolled in the RCT, and in some ways likely to be healthier, if you will, patients than those that decline or are not eligible for the RCT and made it into the registry. Again, sort of important considerations when thinking ultimately about how you're going to translate or transport the results of the RCT into the eventual target population of interest. I just want to follow up then, but the other advantages then of having this registry available is like, again, much like in practical, if you think about practical as being embedded in some registries that we have, some of the benefits are that the data that's collected in all of these randomized trials in the various domains of practical also make up a very large cohort of patients who have acute hypoxemic respiratory failure. And then we can also, in a complementary way, use those data to emulate target trials, right? So again, not a traditional randomized trial, but it's a compromise when we have many questions to answer. We're not going to answer all of them in randomized trials for all the reasons that we talked about. But again, what we can do is use those data, those high quality data that have been collected to emulate target trials. And a target trial is clearly a compromise when we can't conduct the trial in a timely way, in an efficient way, or really maybe it just may not be ethical to conduct. This might be a solution. And again, I know that some people have some antibodies to the idea, especially trialists. You and I have this discussion all the time about this idea that, of course, that randomized trials are the gold standard, and this sort of thing feels like more than just a compromise. And maybe Mark Twain summarized it best by saying there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, which a lot of people feel like target trial emulation sometimes is like pulling the statistical wool over your eyes. But again, I think when done well, it can provide some complementary data while waiting for randomized trials. And of course, they address some of the challenges that we talked about of conducting randomized trials, especially in critically ill patients, especially, again, using my motivating example of ECMO, where the device space, where these things are very challenging. But of course, recognizing, again, that there are many limitations to target trial emulation. And as Miguel Hernan, who's one of the pioneers of the technique, wrote in the previous slide, that we understand that conducting target trial emulation is a compromise as compared to conducting randomized controlled trials. The other advantage of having concurrent registries or underlying registries to look at, building on the theme of representativeness, is the idea of transportability. So again, this idea that what we really want to know is, once we find out something is useful, what is the real world effectiveness and safety of that clinical trial result in, again, the target population that we're interested in. And so this is the idea of transportability of clinical trial results. And we have some great examples, again, from the cardiology space of how you do this. It's like basically when in the Extend DAPT study, so which is a study of dual antiplatelet therapy, focusing on shorter versus longer DAPT after an ischemic event, what you could see is that basically you take the results from the randomized study, and it's basically a reweighting exercise in the registry population, which is the broader group or the target population that you really want to treat, of patients that had PCI that could have shorter versus longer DAPT therapy. So you reweight the patients so that they're similar to understand based on their effect modifiers in the original trial, so that they're similarly positioned in the study population to estimate the real world effect. And of course, the interesting thing here is, as the theme that we've already talked about, is that when you look at the NCDR registry that they use, the real world registry, to extend the results of the original DAPT randomized trial, these patients in the registry had more comorbidities, more likely to have had a myocardial infarction at presentation, received second generation drug-eluting stents. And after they reweighted the trial results, the original DAPT results showed a significant improvement in ischemic events by extending DAPT therapy, that there was no longer a significant effect of prolonged DAPT on stent thrombosis, major adverse cardiac events, or MI. And in fact, in the real world population, there was increased bleeding risk with DAPT that was higher than what was seen in the initial randomized trial. So again, this idea that actually when you transport the results to a real world population, the effects are attenuated, if not gone, and the risks, the adverse events associated with bleeding, were higher. So again, very important information for the real world validation, if you will, of the treatment effect. And this could also be very useful for temporal validation. So an example we've been discussing is, for instance, like doing something like this with ARMA and low tidal volume ventilation. So the ARMA trial was published 25 years ago. And we might see that with changes in underlying populations, their comorbidity, who shows up to the ICU, who develops HRF, and other supportive care strategies we now have in the ICU, would we see the very same results in a real world population of low tidal volume ventilation? That might be an interesting thing to consider, and something that Martin Erner in our center is working on, using some of our real world data. And then finally, of course, the registry we talked about, like not only can you use the registry itself to embed trials, but you could use it as infrastructure for other types of clinical trials. And of course, what we're talking about here is then fusing the registry or underlying registries and data collection infrastructure with something like a platform trial. That's what we're doing in Practical. Practical, as you know, is the reason that we're here. And Practical actually uses as its base infrastructure the two existing registries that we developed here in Toronto. One is the Toronto Intensive Care Observational Registry project called ICOR, and at least for the ECMO part of things is this index database that we talked about. And we merged these registries together to form and streamline and curated some of the data elements and endpoints that are being collected there to form the I2 registry, which underlies Practical. And then, of course, overlying that is for the specific trials will be domain-specific data sets to collect data that's germane to that specific intervention. So in the driving pressure, it could be some ventilatory parameters, physiologic parameters, and Core-D2, things related to steroids and adverse effects related to steroids, so on and so forth. But again, the idea here is that we leveraged two existing registries, merged them together, curated the result to form the data infrastructure for Practical, which we call I2. And that's really, again, the idea of doing what you can with what you have where you are, sort of trying to make things more efficient and less costly. And then finally, I might just say that in the future here, there's, I think, a great ability then to, and again, not traditionally thought of as a registry, but if you think about all the data that's available in our EMR or EHR, that's kind of like a continuous data registry, okay? But a data repository that we might further exploit for the conduct and the efficient conduct of clinical trials. And again, it's part of the reason is that we have a lot of data in the ICU. This is work from Chris Parsham's group at Sick Kids here in Toronto, showing again that the average amount of documented information in a daily in an ICU patient is like 1,000 to 1,500 data elements on all kinds of things that are going on. So there's a ton of data, a whole pipeline of data that could be available. And the idea then is to use that data, again, to facilitate clinical trials. And so, again, probably some of the best examples of this are from the cardiology world and from our colleagues in Scandinavia, who have basically take the source data from their EHRs, they link them to other existing registries. Some of them could be national, some of them could be disease specific, some of them could be device specific. And together, this helps to facilitate and form the data infrastructure for some of the longitudinal data, the outcome data, the adverse event data, mortality data from national registries, and these sorts of things together to facilitate clinical research that's very efficient, timely, and cost effective around things like management of heart failure. So this could be an example for us to use, again, this data infrastructure that's available now in many hospitals around the world from their EMR. That might be the way to do it. I saw earlier that Chad Hochberg is on the call. So Chad is one of the leaders of the CLIF consortium. I think this is an amazing idea and resource that could also facilitate clinical trials and clinical research in the future. So this is a consortium of hospitals across the United States and Canada providing a standard longitudinal ICU data format so that the data across centers can be federated for analysis. Now, again, at the moment, I think the focus, and Chad, you could jump in and tell me if I'm saying anything wrong, most of the focus has been on using the data to conduct retrospective analyses, emulating trials, looking at epidemiologic questions, that sort of thing across sites, and then using either doing that data analysis at their home institutions and then federating that data together to come up with a common analysis across sites. But you can imagine, again, that this infrastructure, this data infrastructure, especially since it leverages a common language, a common organization and format, could then be a powerful tool in the future for federated analyses of clinical trials that are ongoing at sites. I think Chad is actually working on some very innovative uses of this federated data, federated research model. So we're very excited to see how this sort of evolves over time, along with other leaders in the CLIF consortium. And again, the idea that we might include other non-traditional data sources that are available to us that could, again, be very useful in the clinical trial space. So we talked about data that we think about often, like patient information, diagnoses, what interventions they're getting in the ICU, but we could layer on other data sources that are either existing or de novo, like imaging data, biomarker data, biospecimen data, these sorts of things, waveform data. And again, so all these things can be merged together, maybe to complete a more complete picture, either to help with precision or personalized approaches to medicine, so phenotyping patients and then enrolling them in clinical trials, or looking afterwards using that data to, in a post hoc way, to again look at subgroups or subphenotypes in the clinical trial population that have been enabled by the registry or underlying data infrastructure to look for heterogeneity of treatment effect. And so this is the holy grail of what we're talking about, is that we could embed one of the barriers that we talked about at the very beginning of the talk. The barriers is like research and clinical care are very much separated in many institutions around the world. And the idea is that maybe merging or implementing research as a routine standard of clinical care, so that rather than providing random care, we can provide randomized care and really learn something from every patient that comes through the doors of the ICUs that we have, bolstered by the data infrastructure of our EMR and linked registries. And this would be the idea of building a intelligent or learning healthcare system where we could continuously generate knowledge, evaluate that knowledge, and then put that knowledge to practice. Okay, so to summarize, high quality registries can be useful for many purposes: epidemiology, post-marketing surveillance, continuous QI, but importantly for today's talk could be infrastructure for clinical trials. I think hopefully I've demonstrated that registry-embedded trials can leverage existing data sources to make trials more efficient in many, many ways. And depending on the registry and the data that you have available, you can either perform some or almost all facets of a randomized trial within the registry. I think the ultimate holy grail would be to extend that, again, maybe not traditionally thought of as a registry per se, but the same idea of a collected amount of clinical data on patients in our EHR could further facilitate pragmatic randomized control trials. I think using common data languages like the CLIF format would be another way to help accelerate this kind of progress, and we can really create a learning or intelligent health system around that. But again, I hope, and again, not the main focus of today's talk, but that also having this rich registry data as a complement to clinical trials can provide a lot of other useful information that we talked about around more representativeness, external validity, and thinking about issues around transportability of clinical trial results in the future. So with that, I'm going to finish, and I'm happy to take any questions that people might have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eddy. Amazing talk, as usual. While people online either type in or come off mute to ask their questions, Eddy, I guess I had one comment and then one hypothetical question. One of the things that strikes me as maybe most interesting about this registry concept is, translating what we see in an RCT, but then applying it to the sort of modern or the real world data set. You had mentioned that they did this in an antiplatelet trial, and we may be doing it in looking at low tidal volume delivery again. Like, to me, that's maybe one of the coolest parts of all this. And then I guess my hypothetical question is, the using the EHR, some companies whom seem to have monopolies on this to build registries to share data amongst many hospitals seems like the obvious way to go. But from a practical perspective, when the SpO2 at St. Mike's is on flow sheet row X and at UHN the SpO2 is on a completely different flow sheet row, it seems like we're still far from getting the basics right. I don't know if you have any comments on how we can try to mitigate some of these barriers, which seem small but are likely to be significant.
Yeah, so I think exactly for that reason, Michael, and your example is a good one, is the reason I think something like the CLIF format and the idea behind the CLIF consortium is so powerful, because there the idea is that and again, Chad, please jump in if I'm saying something that's incorrect, but is the idea that you're basically using a common taxonomy, common definitions, and a common data format to mitigate these issues, right? That once your data is in the CLIF format, and you can imagine that that's like reorganizing the blocks so they all look the same, right? So I know that when I'm looking at row 7 and a block A3 or something like that, that data is the same data at every site that's using or has organized the data in the CLIF format. So having this common taxonomy data format across sites facilitates the ability to federate data for analysis, whether that's retrospective, I think prospective, or whatever you're thinking about. So I think exactly as you're saying, and of course, Michael, the CLIF consortium is not the only sort of thing that does this. There's other larger platforms. The Mayo Clinic has a platform as well for data and this sort of thing. You're right. And there's some proprietary agencies that do this as well. But again, the advantage for me, thinking about the red cap type analogy to your thing as an open source way forward that's been created by people like Chad and other amazing investigators who are spearheading this effort. I think the CLIF format is a good example of how of the way to move forward on mitigating these challenges. I don't know, Chad, before we get to Allison's question, if you have any other comments about that.
Chad, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
It looks like you've maybe should we go to Allison's question first and then we'll come back to
Yeah.
Chad? Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddy. That was a fortitude of the registry data, and thinking about it for sepsis has been one of the things I've been thinking about. When I look at registries in Canada and Ontario, the cancer registry, cardiology registries, trauma registry, they all worry about data integrity, and they all have people behind the scenes making sure that the data is accurate. That does add costs to having that armamentarium, but it also becomes an impetus to say, like, this is an important reason why governments and others should be funding some of these registries, which is what happens. So I guess my question is, how do we deal with the data integrity coming into the registry to assure that it's true and accurate?
Yeah, I think this is a key point, Allison, which is another reason why I think increasingly having ways to automate data that comes into these registries directly from the EMR. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that those data are necessarily clean just by virtue of coming directly from the source, but just to say that there won't be any errors in the collection or the timing of collection, this sort of things that could plague some of these registries. But agreed, I think a good deal, it's the usual, you can only get out what you put in. And the quality is bad going in, and the quality will not be good coming out. And a good amount of these standalone registries that are not getting automated data streams from our source data, say the EMR, do need to spend time doing that. And whether that's through, especially again, focusing energy on key data elements or key data points, either that are typically used for analysis, like in a trauma registry, you might imagine key variables being something like the injury severity score or something around those key elements that need to be correct. So spending time around validating those and having ongoing random audits of the data to ensure across sites to ensure its validity might be very important. And then, of course, now with things like REDCap and these registries, how they're embedded even in proprietary software, having clear logic checks and query examinations, right, to avoid simple data errors like entering an age of 105. Now that's completely possible, but it requires a couple checks, sort of logical checks that you can't have a PO2 of 10 or a PaO2 of 700 or something like that, sort of just to give examples. So there are some ways to embed checks and systems and queries into the database itself, but certainly validating the data, especially on key elements that are endpoints or outcomes or safety parameters is a major focus for these registries. And of course, that sort of validation then also, if it's important for your use of the data, is key for some regulatory agencies like the FDA or Health Canada that won't use data for regulatory approval unless those registry data have been validated have an internal and external validation to a certain degree. But I completely agree with you.
I guess the other piece of this is the data sharing agreements from between hospitals and EHRs to go into registries and even pull them into a REDCap databases. It's getting more and more complex to be able to do that through privacy legislation. So while I totally agree with you, this is the way to go. Navigating these hurdles is not going to be easy.
Yeah, and I think, again, to give you a bit of, Allison, I'm sure you feel similarly. I think we might have had a conversation about this in the past, but I think as a bit of a pie in the sky, aspirational thing, I think this is where we, a platform like Practical and a consortium like Cliff, and again, maybe when Chad can weigh in, it's like, I think we should really be thinking about how we ally ourselves with, people, experts in our health policy, faculty, ethics, the REBs, the IRBs and this sort of thing to really understand at the societal level how we're going to approach the rational and efficient use of health information. So I'm aware of actually, and again, I guess now that the UK is out of the Europe, but GDPR is like an issue, of course, for some of these data protections. But like in the UK, they've conducted a number of surveys. These have been published, showing that actually the vast majority of the public feel like the rational use of health data, even if it contains some private information, like some of the answers to these surveys, like why are we not doing this already? Like I think so that maybe understanding that having a better contemporary understanding of public opinion around the rational use of data to inform and improve the healthcare system and overall health of Canadians, Americans, global citizens. And then obviously having a very transparent and rational approach to the sharing and use of that data that's becoming, widely available, at least in our EMRs and sort of health systems. I think we need to do that.
When you look at the UK Biobank and all of the data that's been coming out of that, yeah, it's just a classic example of how you use registry data and biosamples at the same time to answer questions.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll let Chad talk.
Yeah. Chad.
Yeah, hopefully, can people hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Thanks for the great talk, Eddy, and yeah, exciting to think about how something like Cliff could fit into this ecosystem. I guess just a comment, and this probably ties back to Allison's point as well, is if we're all speaking the same language within our systems in terms of the data ecosystem, it becomes a lot easier to federate analyses where you don't have to share individual data. And I'm working on a trial now with Kevin Seitz, also a member of the Practical platform, where we have a direct from EHR to REDCap pipeline that he designed at Vanderbilt and was able to send it to us, and it mostly works on first load. So there are ways of doing this, and then you can share data within REDCap without in a completely de-identified manner. And then just one resource I was going to put in the chat is I think the dream for us in something like Cliff is to eventually integrate it with other data standards for really fast and interoperable communication between AHRs. And I think in the US and in the EU, some of these standards are mandated. And it's not perfect and it's not fully built out yet, but integrating with these standards and involving informatics and policy colleagues from the outset in the design of these is, I think, going to be important for the future.
Thanks, Chad.
Any other questions from or comments from the participants? It's 2 minutes to 9, so I think we could probably then close the session.